Before we start, tell us where you're watching from. Professor Adrian Castellano was a man drowning in numbers. Once celebrated as the most brilliant quantum mathematician of his generation, Adrian had built his career on solving the impossible. At 32, he'd been awarded the Fields Medal for his groundbreaking work on temporal mechanics. At 35, he'd been appointed director of the Quantum Research Institute in Geneva. His equations had been called poetry, his lectures performances. Students fought to study under him, and universities around the world begged him to join their faculties. But that was before Sophia, before the diagnosis, before the last equation he could never solve. They'd met at a conference in Barcelona 7 years ago. Adrian had been presenting his latest theorem when he noticed her in the third row, dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him forget his own words. Sophia Reyes, a neuroscientist researching consciousness and memory. Where he dealt in abstractions, she worked with the tangible mysteries of the human mind. "Your equations are beautiful," she'd told him later that night over wine, "but they're lonely. All that elegance and nowhere for it to live." He'd fallen in love with her before dessert arrived. Sophia was everything Adrian wasn't. Where he was methodical, she was spontaneous. Where he saw patterns, she saw people. She taught him to dance badly in their kitchen. She dragged him away from his blackboards to watch sunsets. She made him laugh at his own seriousness. "Life isn't a proof, Adrian," she'd say, kissing his forehead as he worked late into the night. "You don't have to solve everything." But she was wrong about one thing. He did have to solve this. The headaches started during their 5th anniversary dinner. Sophia had laughed them off, blamed the wine, but Adrian noticed the way she gripped the edge of the table, how her eyes lost focus for just a moment too long. 3 weeks later, they sat in a sterile office while a doctor with practiced sympathy explained what the scans showed. Glioblastoma, stage 4, inoperable. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, because that's exactly what they were. "How long?" Adrian's voice cracked. 6 months. Maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. Sophia's hand found his. Her fingers were cold. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He stood in his study, surrounded by whiteboards covered in his life's work, and realized that every equation he'd ever solved, every theorem he'd ever proved, every accolade he'd ever received, none of it mattered. None of it could save her. But maybe, just maybe, he could write one that would. The temporal resonance project had been theoretical, a mathematical framework suggesting that consciousness might exist independent of linear time, that memories, thoughts, experiences might be accessible across temporal boundaries under the right conditions. The equations were there, perfect, elegant, impossible. Adrian had abandoned the work years ago. The mathematics was sound, but the practical application required technology that didn't exist and energy outputs that would rival a small sun. But now, with Sophia's time measured in weeks, impossible didn't seem like enough of a reason to stop. He took a leave of absence from the institute. He converted their garage into a laboratory, filling it with equipment purchased through old colleagues who asked no questions. He worked 18-hour days, translating pure mathematics into engineering, theory into desperate reality. Sophia grew weaker. The treatments bought time, but stole her vitality. Her dark hair fell out in clumps. Her sharp mind began to fog. But she never asked him to stop. "What are you building?" she asked one evening, her voice thin as paper. Adrian looked up from his calculations, eyes bloodshot. "A door." "To where?" He couldn't answer. How could he tell her he was trying to crack open time itself? That he was attempting to create a bridge between moments, a way to reach backward and pull her forward? She smiled weakly. "Always solving the impossible, mi amor. That's why I love you." The device took shape over 4 months. It wasn't elegant, cobbled together from superconductors, modified MRI components, and a quantum processor that Adrian had quite possibly stolen from the Institute. At its heart was a chamber just large enough for one person, surrounded by electromagnetic coils that would generate a field based on his equations. The temporal resonance chamber. His last equation made physical. The theory was brutal in its simplicity. If consciousness could exist across time, then a strong enough resonance field might allow one consciousness to overlap with another version of itself, to essentially switch places with a past iteration, carrying memories forward but inhabiting a body from before. If it worked, Sophia could return to a moment before the cancer. She could live. If it didn't work, Adrian didn't let himself think about that. By month 5, Sophia could barely leave their bed. Hospice nurses came daily. Friends visited with tears and flowers. Her parents flew in from Madrid, their faces carved with grief. One morning, as dawn light filtered through their bedroom window, Sophia took Adrian's hand. "I am scared," she whispered. He pressed her palm to his cheek, tears streaming. "I know. I'm going to fix this." "Adrian," she struggled to focus on his face. "You can't fix death. No one can. Watch me." He finished the machine on a Tuesday. Sophia had been unconscious for 2 days. The doctors said it would be any time now. Hours, maybe minutes. Adrian carried her to the garage in his arms. She weighed nothing, a ghost of the woman who danced with him in their kitchen. He placed her gently in the chamber, securing the monitors that would track her neural activity. "I've calculated the optimal anchor point," he told her, though she couldn't hear. 3 years ago, before any of this. "You'll wake up in our old apartment, and none of this will have happened. You'll be healthy. You'll be whole." He kissed her forehead, tasting salt and sickness. "I love you, Sophia. I'll find you again. I promise." Adrian activated the sequence. The electromagnetic coils hummed to life, generating a field that made the air shimmer like heat waves. The quantum processor spun up, calculating probabilistic pathways through space-time. The numbers on his monitors climbed, energy output reaching impossible levels. The garage lights flickered, dimmed. The entire neighborhood probably lost power. And then, for one perfect moment, the equations aligned. Sophia's body convulsed, the monitors spiked, her eyes flew open, not the clouded, pain-filled eyes he'd grown used to, but clear and terrified and alive. "Adrian?" Her voice was strong, young. Where am I? Why are we in Geneva? We're supposed to be in Barcelona at the conference." His heart stopped. It worked. She was here, his Sophia, from 3 years ago, pulled forward into this dying body. No, no, no. He breathed. Understanding flooded her face as she looked down at her withered hands, felt the alien wrongness of her own body. Adrian, what did you do? What did you do? I was trying to save you. His voice broke. The equations, they were supposed to send you back, not bring you forward. Send me back? She was crying now, trying to pull free from the monitors. I don't want to go back. I want to stay. I want to live.
The chamber began to shake. Warning lights flashed across his monitors. The temporal field was destabilizing, the resonance breaking down. Adrian lunged for the controls, desperately trying to reverse the polarity, to push her consciousness backward instead of forward. But the mathematics were collapsing, the equations fragmenting. I can fix this, he shouted over the rising whine of the machine. I can solve it. Sophia looked at him with those clear, beautiful eyes one last time. Some things can't be solved, Adrian, only loved. The field collapsed. The chamber went dark, and Sophia, his Sophia, all versions of her, every possible iteration, across every possible moment, was gone. They found him 3 days later, unresponsive on the garage floor, the burnt-out husk of his machine smoking around him. The investigation was brief. Technically, he'd done nothing illegal, nothing they could prove anyway. Just a grieving widower who'd lost his mind along with his wife. The institute quietly revoked his position. His colleagues stopped calling. The awards meant nothing. Adrian sold the house. He couldn't bear to stay there, couldn't face the empty garage or the dust-covered piano. He took a teaching position at a small university in the mountains of Peru, as far from Geneva as he could run. For a year, he didn't touch mathematics, didn't write a single equation. He taught basic calculus to undergraduates who didn't know who he'd been, didn't care about temporal mechanics or quantum consciousness. He lived in a small apartment with white walls and no memories. But late at night, alone in the dark, he would sometimes take out his old notebooks, not to work, just to remember. On the last page of the last notebook, Sophia had once doodled a small heart next to one of his equations. He'd scolded her for defacing his work. She'd laughed and done it again.
Looking at it now, Adrian understood what she'd been trying to tell him all along. The most important things, the only things that truly mattered, couldn't be calculated or proven. They could only be felt, lived, lost. 2 years after Sophia's death, Adrian received a letter forwarded from the Institute. Inside was a journal article, recently published, on consciousness and temporal mechanics. The lead author was a young researcher he'd never heard of, but the acknowledgments mentioned his old work on the temporal resonance project. The article concluded that while the mathematics were theoretically sound, practical application would be fundamentally impossible. Not because of technology or energy requirements, but because of something the researchers called temporal inertia, the universe's resistance to paradox. Consciousness, they argued, was too deeply woven into the fabric of space-time to be moved without catastrophic collapse. He read it twice, then set it aside. They were wrong about one thing. He had moved it. For just a moment, he'd succeeded. He'd brought her back. It just hadn't been the version of her he'd wanted to save. He'd spent his whole life believing that with the right equation, anything was possible. That mathematics was the language of the universe, and if you spoke it fluently enough, you could rewrite reality itself. But standing in his small apartment, looking at the mountains through his window, Adrian finally accepted what Sophia had tried to teach him. Some things weren't meant to be solved. Some losses couldn't be reversed. Some pain could only be carried, not calculated away. The last equation, the one that mattered most, wasn't written in numbers at all. It was written in the way she'd laughed at his jokes, the way she'd touched his face when he was lost in thought, the way she'd made him dance, terribly, in their kitchen. Those moments weren't problems to be solved. They were gifts to be remembered.
On the anniversary of her death, Adrian returned to Geneva. He stood outside their old house, sold now to a young family with children. He could see toys scattered across the lawn, hear laughter drifting through open windows, life continuing, as it always did. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked to the cemetery where Sophia was buried. He placed flowers on her grave, orchids, her favorite, and sat beside the headstone. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you told me, about life not being a proof." The wind moved through the trees. "You were right. I spent so long trying to solve you, to save you, that I forgot to just be with you. Even at the end, I was trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, instead of just staying." He traced the letters of her name carved into the stone. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I'm so sorry I couldn't let you go, that I tried to bend the universe itself rather than accept that I'd have to lose you." The grief rose up then, overwhelming and absolute. Not the frantic, desperate grief of those first days, but something deeper, acceptance laced with agony. "I miss you. Every day, every moment, and I'll carry that with me. Not as a problem to solve, but as the price of having loved you." He stayed until sunset, talking to her about everything and nothing, about his students, about the mountains, about the way he'd learned to make her favorite paella, even though it would never taste quite like hers. When he finally stood to leave, he placed his hand on the gravestone one last time. "Thank you for teaching me that some things can't be calculated. They can only be cherished."
Adrian didn't stop being a mathematician. He couldn't. It was too fundamental to who he was. But he learned to hold his work more lightly, to see beauty in unsolved problems, to find peace in questions without answers. He published occasionally, taught with more patience, mentored students who reminded him of his younger self, brilliant but lost in their own heads. And sometimes, when the mathematics flowed just right, when an equation took shape that was particularly elegant, he would think of Sophia, not with the crushing weight of grief, but with gratitude. She had been his greatest theorem, beautiful, complex, irreproducible. And like all the best mathematics, she had changed him forever. Years later, a graduate student would find Adrian's old notebooks in the university archives. Curious, she would begin working through the equations for the temporal resonance project, marveling at their elegance. Her name was Maya Chen, a 24-year-old prodigy from Singapore who'd come to study under the legendary Professor Castellano, though she knew him only as the quiet, melancholic teacher who made differential equations feel like poetry. She didn't know about Geneva, about the institute, about the machine in the garage. No one talked about that anymore. "Professor Castellano," she asked one afternoon, finding him in his office overlooking the mountains, "I found these notebooks in the archives. The temporal mechanics, they're extraordinary. Why did you abandon this work? It's brilliant." Adrian looked up from the paper he'd been grading.
For a moment, Maya saw something flicker across his face, pain so deep it seemed to bend the light around him. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual gentle smile. "Sit down, Maya." She did, clutching the notebooks to her chest. Adrian stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "What do you see when you look at those equations?" "Possibility. A framework for understanding consciousness across temporal boundaries. If the math is right, and I think it is, it means that memory, identity, the core of who we are, it's not locked to linear time. It could be accessible, movable." "And what would you do with that knowledge?" I suppose I'd want to test it, to see if it's really possible." Adrian turned to face her. "Why?"
He handed the notebooks back to her. "You're free to continue the research if you wish. The mathematics are sound. But understand something, Maya. Just because we can solve an equation doesn't mean we should. Just because we can open a door doesn't mean we need to walk through it." Maya left his office that day with the notebooks, but she never opened them again. Years later, when she had her own laboratory and her own students, she would keep them in a locked drawer, a reminder that some knowledge comes with a cost too high to pay. But that conversation changed something in Adrian. For the first time since Sophia's death, he'd spoken about it, really spoken about it. Not just to a therapist or to Sophia's grave, but to another human being who could understand the mathematics of what he'd attempted, even if she couldn't fully grasp the emotional calculus of what he'd lost. It didn't heal him. He suspected nothing ever truly would, but it opened something, a crack in the wall he'd built around his grief. That winter, Adrian received an unexpected visitor. Elena Reyes arrived on a cold December morning, snow dusting the peaks of the mountains outside his window. He knew her immediately, Sophia's younger sister, whom he hadn't seen since the funeral. She'd aged in the intervening years, gray threading through her black hair, but she had Sophia's eyes, the same fierce intelligence, the same warmth. "Elena," he breathed, rising from his desk, "I didn't know you were coming." "You've been avoiding the family." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Mama asks about you. Papa too. They want to know if you're okay." He couldn't finish the lie. "Can I make you coffee?" They sat in his small kitchen, the silence heavy between them. Elena studied him with a doctor's practiced eye. She was a doctor now, Adrian remembered, a cardiologist in Madrid. "You look terrible," she said finally. He laughed, bitter and sharp. "Thank you for the honesty." "I'm serious, Adrian. When was the last time you slept properly, ate a real meal? You're disappearing into yourself." "Is there a question in there?"
Elena set down her cup with more force than necessary. What happened in Geneva? The real story, not the official version about a grieving widower having a breakdown. Adrian's hands tightened around his mug. "Elena, my sister died twice, didn't she?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, turning away. "Who told you?" "No one had to tell me. I know you, Adrian. I know how your mind works. Sophia used to joke about it, how you thought you could mathematically prove your way out of any problem." Elena's voice cracked. "She was dying, and you couldn't accept that it was happening, so you tried to fix it, to solve death like it was just another equation." "I tried to save her." The words exploded out of him.
I tried to give her more time, to send her back to before the cancer, to play God? He turned to face her, tears streaming. Yes. Yes, I tried to play God, because I loved her more than anything in this universe, and I couldn't watch her fade away. I couldn't just let her go. So you brought her back? Elena stood now, her own tears falling. You brought some version of her consciousness forward, didn't you? Made her experience her own death all over again. I didn't mean the calculations they were supposed to. I don't care about the calculations, Elena's voice rose. I care that my sister died terrified and confused because you couldn't accept that some things can't be fixed. The truth of it hit Adrian like a tsunami. He collapsed back into his chair, his body racking with sobs. I know. God, Elena, I know. I've relived that moment every day for 3 years. The look in her eyes when she realized what I'd done, the fear, the betrayal. I was trying to save her, and instead, Elena moved around the table and, to his surprise, pulled him into her arms. She held him as he broke apart, as years of carefully controlled grief finally overwhelmed him. She forgave you, Elena whispered. In the end, I think she forgave you. How can you possibly know that? Because she loved you. And love means forgiving the unforgivable, even when it shouldn't. They stayed like that for a long time, two people bound together by the ghost of the woman they both loved. Finally, Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes. Mama and Papa want you to come home for Christmas. To Madrid. They miss you, Adrian. We all do. I don't know if I can. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. You've hidden in these mountains long enough. Sophia wouldn't want this for you, this half-life, this exile. She'd want you to live. I don't know how anymore. Then we'll teach you, one day at a time, one moment at a time. Elena squeezed his hand. You tried to cheat time for her. Now you need to learn to live in it again, for her. That Christmas in Madrid was the hardest thing Adrian had done since building the machine. Sophia's family welcomed him with open arms, but everywhere he looked, he saw her. In family photographs on the walls, in the way her mother moved through the kitchen, in the piano that sat in the corner of the living room, the same model Sophia had owned. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, Sophia's father, Miguel, a retired literature professor, found Adrian standing alone on the balcony, staring at the lights of the city. She talked about you constantly, Miguel said, joining him in the cold. Even at the end, when the pain was so bad she could barely speak, she'd smile and say, "My Adrian, he's going to save me." Adrian closed his eyes against the knife twist of guilt. I failed her. No, Miguel's voice was firm. You loved her. There's a difference. I built a machine to bend time itself. I succeeded, and it still wasn't enough. Miguel was quiet for a moment. You know what I taught my students about tragedy? Real tragedy isn't when the hero fails because he's weak or stupid. Real tragedy is when he fails because of his greatest strength. Your brilliance, Adrian. It's what made Sophia fall in love with you, and it's what made you think you could save her. I should have just been with her at the end, instead of fighting with every fiber of your being to keep her alive, instead of refusing to accept the unacceptable. Miguel put a hand on Adrian's shoulder. That's not a flaw. That's love in its purest, most desperate form. It was selfish. Maybe, but it was also profoundly human, and Sophia, of all people, would understand that. Inside, someone started playing the piano,
One of Elena's children picking out a simple melody. Miguel smiled sadly. Sophia used to play that song. Do you remember? Adrian nodded, his throat tight. How could he forget? She'd played it the night he proposed, her fingers dancing over the keys while he watched from the doorway, the ring burning a hole in his pocket. Come inside, Miguel said gently. Be with family. Let us help you remember her the way she really was, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who lived and laughed and loved you back. That night, surrounded by Sophia's family, Adrian began to see glimpses of a path forward, not forgetting, never forgetting, but maybe eventually remembering without drowning. The years that followed were neither easy nor linear. Grief, Adrian learned, didn't move in a straight line. It spiraled, doubled back, ambushed him on random Tuesdays when he heard a song she'd loved or caught a whiff of her perfume on a stranger. But slowly, incrementally, he learned to carry it differently. He started attending a support group for widowers in the small mountain town where he lived. At first, he couldn't speak. He'd sit in the circle of folding chairs in the community center basement, listening to other men talk about losing their wives to cancer, accidents, age. Their stories were different from his, but the grief was the same, universal, inescapable. After 6 weeks, he finally spoke. My name is Adrian. My wife died 4 years ago, and I've been trying to solve her death ever since. The group leader, a kind man named Roberto, who'd lost his wife to a heart attack, nodded encouragingly. What do you mean by solve?
Adrian looked at his hands. I'm a mathematician. I thought if I could just find the right equation, the right answer, I could make sense of it. Maybe even change it. Did you find it? The answer? No. The word came out broken. There is no answer. That's what I'm learning. Some things can't be solved. They can only be survived. Roberto smiled sadly. That's the hardest lesson, the one none of us want to learn. After the meeting, an older man named Carlos approached him. The first year, I tried to drink away my grief, Carlos said. The second year, I tried to work myself to death. The third year, I finally accepted that she was gone and I was still here. And I had to decide what to do with that. What did you decide? To live. Really live. Not for her. She's gone. But because of her. Because she loved me, and that love deserves to be honored by a life well lived, not a life wasted on grief. The words stayed with Adrian. That night, he took out a blank notebook, the first he'd touched in years, and began to write. Not equations, not theorems, just memories. The way Sophia's nose crinkled when she laughed. The terrible jokes she'd tell at dinner parties. The time they got lost in Rome and she'd insisted they were going the right way, only to end up at the same fountain 3 times. The morning he'd found her crying in the bathroom, staring at the first clump of fallen hair in the sink. The last time she'd said, I love you, her voice barely a whisper. He wrote for hours, tears blurring the ink. And when he finally stopped, he realized something. These memories didn't need to be solved or proven. They just needed to be preserved, honored, carried forward into whatever time he had left. 5 years after Sophia's death, Adrian made a decision. He contacted the university archives and donated all his research materials from the Temporal Resonance Project. Every equation, every blueprint, every failed calculation. But he included a letter
sealed and marked not to be opened until after his death.
In it, he wrote, "To whoever finds these papers, the mathematics contained in these notebooks represent years of work, perhaps the most sophisticated temporal mechanics equations ever developed. They are, as far as I can determine, theoretically sound. They are also the most dangerous thing I've ever created. I built a machine based on these equations. I used it to try to save someone I loved. It worked. For 47 seconds, I succeeded in moving consciousness across time. And in doing so, I caused more pain than the disease I was trying to prevent. If you're reading this, you're probably brilliant, probably ambitious, probably convinced, as I once was, that with enough intelligence and determination, any problem can be solved. Let me tell you what I learned. Some problems aren't meant to be solved. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some equations lead not to enlightenment, but to suffering. Time is not our enemy. Loss is not a puzzle to be solved. Death is not a bug to be fixed. They are part of the fundamental structure of reality, and trying to change them doesn't make us noble or heroic. It makes us hubristic fools who value our own brilliance more than we value the natural order of things. If you choose to continue this research, I can't stop you, but I beg you to consider the cost, not just to yourself, but to those you think you're saving. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes wisdom means accepting what cannot be changed. Sometimes the greatest act of intelligence is knowing when to stop. I hope you're smarter than I was. Professor Adrian Castellano. After sending the letter, Adrian felt lighter somehow, as if by warning future generations he'd found some small redemption for his failure. He continued teaching, continued mentoring, continued slowly, painfully learning to live in a world without Sophia. And then, 6 years after her death, something unexpected happened.
Her name was Isabella. She was a literature professor at the university, sharp-witted, kind, with a laugh that reminded Adrian of wind chimes. They met at a faculty dinner, seated next to each other by accident or fate. "You're the famous mathematician," she said, extending her hand. "The one who makes numbers beautiful." "I don't know about famous or beautiful. My students disagree. They say your lectures are like poetry." They talked through dinner, about books and equations, about the mountains and the small absurdities of academic life. Isabella had lost her husband 3 years earlier to a climbing accident. She understood grief in a way that didn't need explanation. When dinner ended, Adrian found himself not wanting the conversation to end. Would you like to have coffee sometime?" he asked, the words feeling strange and rusty. Isabella smiled. "I'd like that." Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, like a plant in poor soil. Adrian was terrified at first, terrified of betraying Sophia's memory, terrified of losing someone again, terrified that his capacity for love had been permanently damaged by grief and guilt. But Isabella was patient. She never asked him to forget Sophia. She understood that grief and love could coexist, that you could honor the dead while still living among the living. "I'm not trying to replace her," Isabella said one evening as they walked through the mountains. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. But Adrian, you're allowed to be happy again. That's not betrayal. That's survival." "I killed her," he confessed, the words spilling out. "Not directly, but I built a machine, and I tried to change time, and I made everything worse." Isabella stopped walking. "And you've punished yourself for it ever since." "I deserve." "What you deserve is forgiveness. From yourself. Sophia would want that for you." "You didn't know her." "No, but I know love. Real love doesn't demand eternal penance. It asks for memory, yes. Honor, yes. But also for you to keep living, to keep finding joy, to keep being human." Adrian looked at this woman who'd somehow found space in his broken heart and felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not hope that he could fix the past or undo his mistakes, just hope that maybe, possibly, he could build a future worth living. 7 years after Sophia's death, Adrian and Isabella were married in a small ceremony in the mountains. Sophia's family attended. Elena stood as a witness, tears streaming down her face. "She would have liked Isabella," Elena told Adrian during the reception. "They both saw through your brooding genius act." Adrian laughed, and it felt good. Natural, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use, finally remembering its purpose. That night, lying next to Isabella in the darkness, Adrian whispered, "I still miss her." "I know," Isabella replied, taking his hand, "and that's okay. Love doesn't end just because life does. You carry her with you, and I carry Marco, and we move forward together, carrying our dead with us, honoring them by living well." Adrian understood then what his last equation had really been about. It wasn't about the mathematics of temporal mechanics or the physics of consciousness. It was about this: learning to hold loss and love simultaneously. Learning that you could grieve one person while loving another. Learning that the heart had a capacity for both remembering and continuing that defied all logic. Some equations, he realized, could only be solved by living them. On the 10th anniversary of Sophia's death, Adrian made his annual pilgrimage to Geneva, but this time Isabella came with him. They stood together at Sophia's grave, the orchids Adrian had brought bright against the gray stone. "Tell me about her," Isabella said softly. And so Adrian did. He told her about the conference in Barcelona, about Sophia's terrible jokes and beautiful mind, about the way she danced with him in their kitchen, about her bravery in the face of death, about his desperate, doomed attempt to save her. "I made her die twice," he concluded, his voice breaking, "and I'll never forgive myself for that." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then she knelt beside the grave, placing her hand on the stone. "Sophia, I'm Isabella. I love your husband, not instead of you, but after you. I promise to take care of him, to remind him to eat and sleep, to make him laugh when he gets too lost in his head. I promise to honor your memory by helping him live." Adrian couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his face as Isabella stood and wrapped her arms around him. "She forgives you," Isabella whispered. "I know she does. Now you need to forgive yourself." Later, as they walked back to their hotel, Adrian felt something shift inside him. Not healing. The wound would never fully heal, but acceptance. The kind of acceptance that allowed him to carry his grief without being crushed by it. He would never forget Sophia, never stop loving her, never regret those 47 seconds when he'd played God and lost. But he could also choose to keep living, to honor her memory not with self-destruction, but with a life well lived, with love given and received, with students mentored and equations solved, with quiet moments of joy that would have made her smile. That evening, back in his hotel room, Adrian opened his laptop and began to write. Not an equation this time, but something else, something he'd been avoiding for a decade. The Last Equation, a memoir of love, loss, and the mathematics of grief, by Adrian Castellano. He wrote through the night, pouring everything onto the page, the science and the sorrow, the brilliance and the catastrophe, the machine and the garage, and the moment it all fell apart, his years of exile and slow recovery, the support group and the memories, meeting Isabella and learning to love again. And finally, the lesson he'd paid so dearly to learn. Some equations have no solution. Some problems cannot be fixed. Some losses must simply be carried.
But that doesn't mean they're meaningless. The love he'd shared with Sophia, that was real. The pain of losing her, that was real too. And so was the life he was building now with Isabella, in the shadow of that loss. All of it was real. All of it mattered. All of it was part of the great, unsolvable equation of human existence. When he finished writing, dawn was breaking over Geneva. Adrian closed his laptop and looked out the window at the city where his life had once fallen apart. Thank you, Sophia, for loving me, for forgiving me, for teaching me that some things can't be solved, only survived, only remembered, only carried forward with grace. Years later, when Adrian finally retired from teaching, he would publish that memoir. It would become required reading for ethicists and scientists working on consciousness research. A cautionary tale about the hubris of believing we can engineer our way out of the human condition. But more than that, it would reach people who'd never heard of temporal mechanics or quantum consciousness. People who were simply trying to survive their own losses. People who needed to know that grief doesn't have a solution, but that you can learn to live with it anyway. Maya Chen, his former student, would write the foreword. In it, she would say, "Professor Castellano taught me many things about mathematics, but the most important lesson had nothing to do with equations. He taught me that wisdom isn't about knowing the answer, it's about knowing when to stop asking the question." Adrian would read those words with tears in his eyes, grateful that his failure might prevent someone else from making the same mistake. That something good might come from all that pain. That Sophia's death, both deaths, might not be meaningless after all. On quiet nights, Adrian still dreams of the garage, of the moment when Sophia's eyes cleared and she looked at him with recognition and terror, of the desperate, impossible hope that died with the failing of his machine. Comment one word that describes how this story made you feel. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to Tales Flicks for more tales about love, loss, and the equations we can't solve, only live through.